Montana Territory, 1878. The night settled on Ash Mesa not like a blanket, but like a shroud of freezing mist. It was a cold that crept, a living thing that worked its way through wool and leather to find the bone. Wind, sharp as a filleting knife, screamed through the ponderosa pines, stripping them of their autumn dignity and leaving them to keen in the darkness. Down in Ghost Lantern Valley, an unseasonable blizzard had descended with the fury of a biblical plague, a swirling vortex of white that erased the world, and in the heart of that erasure was Lenora Vale. At 28, she felt 100. The last 6 months had carved decades into her face, pulling the skin taut over her cheekbones and leaving shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of sleep could banish. She was the widow of a miner, a title that felt as ill-fitting as her late husband's oversized coat, which she now wore. It sent a faint mix of sweat, black powder, and the pipe tobacco he favored was both a comfort and a constant, twisting pang of grief. Lost. The word was too small for her predicament. She was being swallowed. Her horse, a scrawny mare named Patience with ribs like a washboard and a spirit nearly as broken as her own, stumbled onward through the deepening drifts. Each step was a gamble, a lurching prayer against a hidden rock or a sudden drop. Lenora clung to the worn leather of the saddle horn, her body a single, agonizing ache. The cold was a thief, stealing the feeling from her fingers and toes, leaving behind a dull, throbbing burn. Tucked inside her saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, plain wooden box. It was no bigger than a Bible, but it held her entire future, her only chance at justice. Inside rested a duplicate of the mining claim her husband, Elias, had filed. It was proof. Proof that the section of the Morning Star mine he'd been working wasn't barren, as the rail ore syndicate had claimed. Proof that the accidental collapse that had taken his life and the lives of 4 other men was a lie. A calculated act of murder engineered to seize the silver vein he had discovered. Elias had told her, his voice a low rumble of excitement just days before he died. "It's the motherlode. Nora, enough to set us up for good, enough to leave this godforsaken dust bowl behind." The syndicate, with its web of lawyers and hired guns, had called it a tragedy. Lenora knew it for what it was, a burial. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm that was lost in the symphony of the storm. The wind howled like a legion of damned souls. And beneath it, in the quiet chambers of her memory, she could still hear the peal of the church bell from the town of daybreak. It was a sound that had once meant Sunday service, community picnics, the steady, predictable passage of time. Now, it echoed in her mind as a toll for the dead, a phantom of a life that had been stolen from her. She had fled daybreak under the cover of a moonless night, a whisper from a sympathetic assayer, her only warning. "They know you have the papers, Mrs. Vale. They won't let you reach the federal marshal in Fort Ellis." Miles away, yet occupying the same unforgiving landscape, a man stood motionless under the granite overhang of a cliff face. He was a part of the stone, a shadow within shadows. His name was Atsidi Cole, though the name his Apache mother had given him was Hashkitsu Angry Stone. He wore buckskins, worn smooth and dark with use, and his silence was as profound as the mountain itself. His eyes, the color of wet obsidian, scanned the swirling chaos before him. They missed nothing. He was not looking for shelter from the storm. The storm was an inconvenience. Nothing more. He was reading a story the blizzard was trying to erase. He was tracking a party of 4 riders, hired men. He could tell by the way they rode, bunched together for confidence, not fanned out like seasoned trackers. He could tell by the shod tracks of their grain-fed horses, so different from the unshod ponies of his people or the tough mustangs of the high country. An hour ago, he'd found a carelessly dropped cigar stub, its end still damp. They were close. These were the men who had shot up a small homesteader's cabin near the Crazy Mountains, leaving 2 old folks dead for the sake of a water right the syndicate wanted. Atsidi had been paid to find them, not by the law, but by a cousin of the murdered couple. It was not justice he was after. It was balance. He had once worked for the white man's army, a scout who knew the secret ways through the canyons and the hidden water holes. He had done it for the promised food and blankets for the elders on the reservation, a promise that had turned to dust, like so many others. The memories of that time were a constant, bitter taste in his mouth, a shame that clung to him like the scent of campfire smoke. He had led soldiers through lands that were sacred, shown them paths that should have remained hidden. He had vowed never again to interfere in their affairs. Let the desert claim its own. It was a harsh law, but a clean one. A jagged spear of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the valley in a ghastly, silent flash. For a fraction of a second, the world was a stark etching of white snow and black rock. In that brief, brilliant moment, Atsidi saw her, a lone rider, slumped low over her horse, a ghost against the maelstrom. The thunder that followed was a physical blow, a crack that seemed to split the very foundations of the earth. Patience, the scrawny mare, screamed in terror and reared. Lenora, her strength utterly spent, was thrown from the saddle. She landed in a heap in the snow, the air driven from her lungs in a painful gasp. The small wooden box flew from the saddlebag, tumbling end over end before skittering across a patch of ice and vanishing into a deep, narrow fissure in the rock. "No!" The cry was torn from her throat, a raw sound of pure despair. She scrambled toward the crevice, her frozen fingers clawing uselessly at the snow-slicked stone. The box was gone, swallowed by the darkness. With it went her hope, her purpose, the last tangible piece of Elias. A wave of blackness rose up to meet her, and she collapsed, a small, dark shape against the unforgiving white. Atsidi watched from his stony perch. The law of the desert was clear. She was not his concern. Her fight was not his fight. He should turn away, continue his own hunt, and let her fate be decided by the storm and the mountain. It was the way of things. Survival was a solitary battle. But then the image of the old homesteader's wife, her silver hair matted with blood, flashed in his mind. He remembered the faces of the children on the reservation, their eyes wide and hungry. He had turned away then, telling himself it was not his place to intervene. He had followed his orders, and the guilt had gnawed at him ever since. He looked at the fallen woman, at the utter finality of her crumpled form. He saw not a white woman, but another victim of the same relentless greed that had taken so much from his own people. The desert could have her, or he could not let it. A flicker of movement in the distance decided for him. The 4 riders. They were cresting the ridge, dark silhouettes against the swirling snow. They hadn't seen him, and they likely hadn't seen her fall, but they were coming, with a curse that was silent on his lips. Atsidi moved. He flowed down the rock face with the silent grace of a mountain cat, his moccasins finding purchase where there seemed to be none. He reached Lenora in seconds, his shadow falling over her. She was light, fragile as a bird. He scooped her up from the snow, her head lolling against his shoulder. She was cold, so cold. Her life was flickering like a candle in the wind. Crack-zing. A sound like a giant whip crack echoed through the valley, followed by a high-pitched whine, a stray bullet, fired carelessly by one of the approaching riders, slammed into the rock face just inches from Atsidi's head. A spray of granite chips stung his cheek, and a single, brilliant blue spark erupted from the point of impact, a lonely firefly in the gloom. Before winking out, there was no more hesitation. This was his fight now. They had made it so. Holding Lenora tight against his chest with one arm, he turned and plunged into the rocks. He knew this place. He knew its secrets. A few yards away, hidden behind a curtain of withered, snow-dusted willow bushes, was a narrow opening. The locals called it Dry Willow Wash, but it was more of a throat, a dark passage that led deep into the heart of the mesa. It was a place no one would look, a place easily missed by those who didn't know the land's soul. He squeezed through the opening, the rough stone scraping at his back. Inside, the roar of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by a heavy, dripping silence. He moved deeper into the darkness, the air growing still and tasting of damp earth and cold stone. Outside, the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, then passed directly by the hidden entrance. Lenora could hear the muffled shouts of men, their voices swallowed by the storm. The sound was a terrifying wave that washed over the mouth of their sanctuary before receding into the distance. Then, there was only the wind again. Atsidi laid her down gently on the sandy floor of the cave. She was shivering violently, her breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs, as thin and insubstantial as smoke in the frigid air. Her eyelids fluttered, but she did not wake. The spark of her life was fading fast. He knelt beside her, his expression unreadable in the gloom. He leaned close, his face just inches from hers. He could feel the faint, desperate warmth of her exhalations against his skin. He would not let the desert have her. He would not let the syndicate have her. She had a fire inside her, the same fire that had driven her out into the storm with nothing but a prayer and a box full of paper. It was his turn to feed that fire. He spoke, his voice a low whisper, not in the harsh guttural English he used with the whites, but in the soft, flowing cadence of his mother tongue. It was a language of the earth, of the wind and the water. "Holly," he murmured, his breath warming her forehead. "Stand up." The cave was a pocket of absolute black, a silence so deep it felt heavier than the mountain above them. Then, a sound, the scrape of flint against steel, a spark. Then another. They were small, fierce stars born and dying in the dark. Atsidi worked with an economy of motion, his hands knowing the texture of the tinder bundle by feel alone. He blew gently, a steady, controlled breath. A tiny orange ember glowed, pulsed, and then, with a soft whoosh, caught. A small, crackling flame licked at the dry kindling he had stacked. In seconds, the fire took hold, climbing the larger pieces of pitchy pine he'd stored in a dry recess of the cave. Light bloomed, pushing the oppressive darkness back into the deeper corners, revealing walls of striated granite and a floor of soft, dry sand. The scent that filled the air was sharp and sacred, the holy perfume of burning pine resin, mingling with the earthy dust of the cave and the pungent, clean smell of a bundle of sage he tossed onto the stones ringing the fire. The light illuminated Lenora. She lay where he had placed her, a pale, still figure against the dark furs he'd spread beneath her. Her face was the color of old wax, tinged with blue at the lips and earlobes. Her breathing was a shallow, alarming flutter. Atsidi moved from the fire to a small, charred pot. He took a water skin and poured a measure of water into it, adding a pinch of dried, crushed petals from a leather pouch, wild chamomile. He set the pot on the stones near the fire, close enough to heat but not to boil. He was a man of deliberate actions. Nothing was wasted. He knelt beside her again. The light of the new fire danced in his dark eyes, making them look like polished obsidian. He placed 2 fingers against the side of her throat. Searching for the carotid artery, he found it, a weak, thready beat, a frantic butterfly trapped beneath his touch. He shifted his fingers to her wrist, beneath the soaked cuff of her glove. He felt the pulse there, too faint and fast. She was alive, but the cold had sunk its teeth deep into her. He worked quickly. He pulled her sodden gloves from her hands. Her fingers were stiff, the skin white and puckered. He began to chafe them vigorously between his own palms, his hands rough as cured leather but generating a powerful, dry heat. He rubbed her wrists, her forearms, trying to force the blood to move, to remember its purpose, the sensation. A sudden, agonizing prickle of returning life was enough to pull her from the depths. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. She was looking at a ceiling of rock, bathed in the flickering orange glow of a fire. She was disoriented, her mind a fog. Then she saw him, a face, carved, it seemed, from the same red stone as the canyon walls. High cheekbones, a strong nose, and eyes that held the firelight without reflecting it. He was above her, his hand still holding hers. She tried to pull away, a sudden jolt of panic, but she had no strength. "It's all right," he said. His voice was low, and the English was measured, as if he built each word carefully before speaking it. She blinked, trying to make the world cohere. The cave, the storm, the fall, the box. The box, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Later, stay, he commanded, not unkindly. Tears of weakness welled in her eyes. I am... She needed to say her name. It was the only thing she had left. Lenora Vale. He nodded once. A slow acknowledgement. He released her hands and pointed a single, steady finger at his own chest. At CD. The introduction hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting two worlds. Lenora's shivering intensified, racking her small frame. Her clothes were a shell of ice-laden wool, leaching what little warmth she had left. Atsidi saw it. He turned from the fire and picked up a long, flat-edged piece of obsidian he used as a utility blade. Lenora's eyes widened, but she was too weak to move. He didn't look at her face. He focused on the shoulder of her dress, where the thick, wet wool was frozen fast to the skin beneath, a dark patch of bruising already forming from her fall. Her old wounds, the ones of grief and fear, were now joined by a physical one. This must come off, he said. It was a statement of fact. He didn't wait for an answer she couldn't give. With a surgeon's precision, he used the stone blade not to cut the fabric, but to carefully work it free from the raw skin, separating ice from flesh. His hands, she noted through a haze of pain and cold, were calloused and scarred. They were the hands of a man who had fought the wilderness and won, day after day. Yet his touch was inexplicably gentle. He worked with a patient, practiced tenderness, as if he were tending to a wounded fawn. He managed to peel the sodden bodice and sleeves away from her upper body without further tearing her skin. The sudden rush of cold air against her exposed skin made her gasp, a raw, sharp sound. But before the cold could settle, he was there, wrapping her shoulders and torso in a length of soft, dry deerskin that had been warming by the fire. It was bliss. The leather was supple, smelling faintly of wood smoke and curing herbs, and it cocooned her in immediate, profound warmth. He deftly tucked it around her, covering her completely, his movements impersonal and efficient. He had seen to her survival, not her modesty. And in that moment, survival was the only prayer she had. He moved back to the fire and retrieved the steaming pot. He poured the pale, fragrant tea into a small cup carved from soapstone. He knelt, lifted her head with one hand, and held the cup to her lips. Drink. The liquid was hot, bordering on scalorific, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It tasted of flowers and earth and life. She sighed drunk in small, choking sips, the heat spreading from her throat down into her chest, a slow, crawling sunrise in her frozen core. He let her rest, then gave her more, until the cup was empty. She lay back, her head spinning, but the violent, bone-rattling shivers were beginning to subside into a more manageable trembling. Her gaze, unfocused, drifted to his chest as he tended the fire. Hanging from a simple leather thong around his neck was a peculiar stone. It was dark, perhaps obsidian or basalt, and polished smooth, shaped like a fat, falling raindrop. Carved into its surface was a single, intricate line, a complex spiral that seemed to move in the firelight, like the swirling clouds of a storm clearing, or a fingerprint of the wind itself. It was beautiful, ancient, and seemed to hum with a quiet energy. It held her gaze, a point of focus in the swirling chaos of her mind. She drifted, her consciousness a piece of flotsam on a dark sea, rising and falling. When she surfaced again, the fire was burning lower, and the man, Atsidi, was sitting cross-legged, staring into the flames. The silence in the cave was thick, a stark contrast to the distant, muffled scream of the wind, which sounded like a train passing through the mountain. She had to know. Where was she? Who was this man who had saved her? Who had touched her with such impersonal care? "Do you?" she managed, her voice still rough. "Do you live here alone?" He turned his head, his dark eyes fixing on her. He considered the question, as if weighing its true meaning. "Alone," he said, his gaze shifting back to the fire. "It is easier to hear the wind speak true." His words settled over her. They were not lonely words. They were words of purpose. He was a man who listened, not just spoke. She thought of Elias, who had been full of noise, of laughter, of booming plans and grand pronouncements. This man was the opposite. He was silence. He was stone, the storm, as if angered by their small pocket of safety, lashed the mountain with renewed violence. A gust of wind forced its way through the narrow entrance, bringing with it a spray of fine, powdery snow and a blast of Arctic cold that made the flames dance wildly. Lenora cried out, shrinking under the deerskin. Atsidi rose in one fluid motion. He moved to the entrance, where a large, cured wolf pelt lay rolled. He unrolled it, a massive, heavy skin with the fur still thick and gray. He wrestled it into place, securing it over the opening with a system of wooden toggles and leather loops she hadn't noticed before. The cave was instantly sealed. The roar of the wind dropped to a distant, angry hum. The small space felt suddenly, intensely intimate, safe. He returned to the fire. He took a small, greasy parcel from his pack. He sliced off a piece of dark, cured salt pork with a hunting knife and skewered it on a stick. He held it over the coals until it sizzled, the smell of rendering fat filling the cave. It was a smell of life, of sustenance. He cooked a second piece. He brought both to her, laying them on a flat, clean stone. "Eat, you need strength." He took one piece, and gestorian for her to take the other. It was, she realized, his last piece. He was sharing his final provisions. She ate. The meat was impossibly salty, tough as boot leather, and utterly delicious. It was fuel. She felt the salt and fat hit her system, a jolt of energy that was almost painful. She watched him eat his portion, his movements economical, his jaw working steadily. He ate like he did everything else with focus, without waste. The hours passed. The storm did not abate. The small fire, their beacon of life, was consuming their meager supply of wood at an alarming rate. Atsidi banked it, preserving the coals, but the warmth began to recede. The heat of the tea and the meat was fading. The pervasive, biting chill of the high country night began to seep back into the cave. It came up from the stone floor. It radiated from the walls. Lenora's shivering returned, a deep, internal quake. Atsidi watched her. He added another dry log to the fire, but it was a temporary solution. He looked at the dwindling wood pile. He looked at Lenora, her teeth chattering, her body curling into a tight, desperate ball under the deerskin. He had done all he could, all but one thing. He rose and pulled the remaining furs, another thick deer hide, and a heavy, matted buffalo robe from his pack. He laid them out beside her, building up the insulation from the cold floor. Then he looked at her, his face a mask in the dimming light. It was a choice between propriety and life. In this world, that was no choice at all. He lay down on the furs, not touching her, but close. Close enough that the radiant heat from his body could be felt across the small gap. It wasn't enough. The cold was a predator, and it was circling them. Lenora, half delirious, felt the cold dragging her down, back into the black, peaceful numbness. It would be so easy to sleep, so easy to let go. But then she felt a presence beside her, a solid, living warmth. She turned her head, her eyes barely focusing. He was there. "Don't," she whispered, the word fragile as frost. "Don't go." It was not a plea for company. It was the last, desperate cry of her body for heat, for life. Atsidi heard her. He gave a single, curt nod, as if accepting an order. He moved again, this time lifting the edge of the heavy buffalo robe. He shifted closer, pulling the robe over both of them, creating a shared pocket of air. He lay on his back, stiff as a plank, his arms crossed over his chest, maintaining a careful, respectful distance. But he was there. His shoulder was a few inches from hers. The sheer, radiating heat from his body was a wall against the cold. Lenora let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She was on the edge of consciousness, drifting in a place where fear and relief were indistinguishable. She could feel his presence, not as a threat, but as an anchor. He was a great, dark rock, and she was a storm-tossed ship. The waves still crashed, but she was no longer adrift. His presence was a shoreline. For the first time since Elias had been lowered into the ground, for the first time since she'd fled daybreak with her heart in her throat, her heart beat for a reason other than terror. It beat slow and steady. Finding the rhythm of the man breathing beside her, the night sealed itself in. Outside, the storm raged, but it was a distant problem. Inside the cave, the fire burned down to a bed of breathing crimson embers. The sound of the wind was gone, replaced by a new, softer sound. The sound of snow falling gently, piling deep and silent against the wolf pelt at the entrance. It was a sound like ashes, falling softly on a fire that had not, against all odds, gone out. The morning broke not with a sound, but with a profound and sudden absence of it. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving a world scrubbed clean and silent, draped in a thick blanket of snow that swallowed all noise. Light filtered into the cave, a soft, gray luminescence that seeped around the edges of the wolf pelt. Lenora woke slowly, untangling herself from a deep, healing sleep. For a moment, she knew only two things: she was warm, and she was not alone. Atsidi was already gone from her side. He sat by the entrance, which he had partially unblocked, silhouetted against the pale dawn. He was sharpening the obsidian blade on a whetstone. The rhythmic shh, the only sound in their small sanctuary. He had rebuilt the fire into a small, smokeless pyramid of coals that provided a steady, gentle heat. A tin cup of what smelled like pine needle tea was warming on a rock nearby. The aches in her body returned, sharp and insistent, but the deep, soul-crushing cold was gone. The deerskin wrap was still tucked around her shoulders, and she clutched it. The warmth, a tangible reminder of the night's strange, silent intimacy. Her mind, no longer clouded by cold and exhaustion, cleared with a painful snap. The box. She sat up, the furs falling away. Atsidi's head turned, his eyes acknowledging her, but he said nothing. She didn't need him to. She scrambled to her feet, her borrowed coat feeling stiff and foreign, and stumbled out of the cave's narrow throat into the blinding new day. The valley was transformed. Every sharp edge of rock was softened. Every pine branch bowed low under a heavy ermine coat. A thick mist clung to the ground, muffling the landscape and making the world feel small and close. She made her way back to the fissure, her boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. The air was so cold and still it felt like glass, as if a loud noise might shatter it. She knelt at the edge of the crevice, her heart a cold stone in her chest, and then she saw it. Far below, wedged sideways between two dark, wet walls of granite, was the small, rectangular shape of the wooden box. It was intact. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through her. She reached for it, her arm extending down into the cold, dark space. But it was useless. Her fingertips were a good 2 feet short of touching it. It might as well have been at the bottom of the ocean. She tried lying flat, stretching until her shoulders screamed in protest. But it was no use. The box was a promise just out of reach, a perfect, maddening metaphor for her life. She didn't weep. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her. She simply stared, a dull despair beginning to settle over her. She had survived the storm only to be defeated by a few feet of empty space. A shadow fell over her. Atsidi stood there, looking down into the fissure, his expression unreadable. He took in the situation with a single, sweeping glance. He didn't offer condolences or easy reassurances. He simply turned and walked back toward the cave. For a horrifying moment, Lenora thought he was leaving her, that he had fulfilled his obligation and was now abandoning her to her hopeless task. He returned a minute later carrying a coil of rope. It was not like any rope she had ever seen. It was thick and coarse, a pale, fibrous tan, braided with an intricate, tight weave. It was a rope born not of a factory, but of the desert itself, woven from the tough, stringy fibers of the yucca plant. It looked ancient, unbreakable, a rope braided from the very sinews of the land. In his other hand, he carried a stout piece of fire-hardened wood, notched at both ends. Without a word, he knelt beside the fissure. He worked a series of knots near one end of the rope, creating a secure loop which he cinched around the notched piece of wood, creating a T-shaped anchor. He wedged the anchor deep into a crack in the solid rock ledge a few feet back from the crevice, pulling on it with his full weight to test its hold. It didn't budge. He uncoiled the rest of the rope and let the end of it fall into the darkness. He looked at her then. "Stay back." He swung his legs over the edge, his feet finding invisible holds on the sheer rock face. He moved with a terrifying, fluid confidence, not like a man climbing, but like a creature of the rock, a lizard or a spider. He used the rope more for balance than for support. His body braced against the opposing wall of the narrow chasm. His shadow slid down the rock face like a hawk's, a fleeting darkness against the gray stone. Lenora watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the icy ledge, her breath a frozen cloud in the air. Her entire life, the memory of her husband, her only chance at justice. All of it depended on the strength of that handmade rope and the skill of this silent, formidable stranger. He reached the box. He worked it free from its granite prison with careful, deliberate movements, tucking it securely into a pouch at his belt. He began his ascent. He emerged from the fissure a few moments later, pulling himself over the ledge with a single, powerful motion. He was not even breathing hard. He walked over to her, pulled the box from his pouch, and placed it in her trembling hands. Her fingers closed around the familiar, smooth wood. It was cold, but it was real, solid. She looked up at him, her throat too tight for words. "Thank you," she finally managed, the words thin and inadequate in the vast silence. He gave a short, sharp nod, already coiling his rope. She hurried back to the relative warmth of the cave, sinking down onto the furs near the fire. With numb, fumbling fingers, she worked the small brass latch. The lid creaked open. Inside, safe and dry, lay the papers. She lifted them out. The first was the duplicate of the mining claim, its legalistic script and official seal a stark contrast to the wildness around them. She set it aside and picked up the second item, Elias's small, leather-bound notebook. She opened it. The pages were filled with her husband's cramped, slightly angry script. Most of it was calculations, figures on timbering costs, notes on assay results, but in the margins, and on the last few pages, were the entries she was looking for. Her finger traced the words as she read them, some of them aloud in a whisper. October 12th, Sutter running the blasting crew again. Odd hours. Sent everyone home but his own men for the midnight charge. Said it was to clear Rockfall. Strange. October 14th. The timbering on level 3 feels wrong. Shaky. Mentioned it to Sutter. He laughed it off. Said I worried too much. October 16th. Milt and Johnny think so too. Sutter's putting in extra charges. Shaping the vein, he calls it, more like shaping a coffin. The words were a voice from the grave, a chilling confirmation of all her fears. This notebook, this was the real proof. It was motive. It was premeditation. She turned her attention back to the official claim document. She scanned the dense text until she found the signatures at the bottom. Elias's bold, confident hand, and beside it, representing the Rail Ore Syndicate, a signature written in a neat, precise, almost delicate script that seemed at odds with the brutal business it represented. Barnaby Sutter. The name hit her with physical force. The air left her lungs. It was him. She breathed, the words turning to ice in the air. It was him all along. Atsidi had finished with his rope and now sat stirring the coals of the fire. He looked at her, his head tilted slightly, waiting. Barnaby Sutter, she explained, her voice shaking with a cold rage. He was the foreman. Elias trusted him at first, but then he started to suspect. Sutter was always talking about how the claim wasn't worth much, trying to convince Elias to sell his share to the syndicate for pennies. When Elias found the new silver vein, he told Sutter he was a fool, that they were all going to be rich. A week later, he was dead. The casual cruelty of Sutter's signature, so neat and orderly, felt like a final, mocking insult. Atsidi's face remained impassive, but his eyes were dark and intense. He looked from her face to the papers in her lap. His gaze was heavy, analytical. "If this is true," he said, his voice a low rumble, "men will come for this paper." As if his words were a summons, a sound drifted into the cave from the world outside. It was faint, indistinct at first, the clink of metal striking rock, a muffled curse, quickly swallowed by the mist. Instantly, Atsidi was on his feet, his body coiled and alert. He held up a hand for silence, though she had already frozen. He moved to the mouth of the cave, peering through a small gap in the wolf pelt. The sounds came again, closer this time. They were the sounds of men who were not at home in this wilderness. They were clumsy, noisy. They were hunting with their ears, not their eyes. He crept out of the cave, melting into the rocks and willows at the entrance. Lenora's heart hammered against her ribs. She carefully placed the papers and the notebook back in the box, closed the lid, and held it to her chest as if it were a shield. Atsidi returned as silently as he had left. "4 of them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "At the head of the wash, they found your horse's tracks from yesterday, before the snow got deep." He crouched, drawing in the sand on the cave floor. "They are looking for the place you fell." He then scraped his finger over a patch of sand and looked at her. "They're boots," he said. "Have iron on the heel, like soldiers. Not miners, not ranchers, professionals." The word settled in her stomach like a lead weight. They hadn't given up. They had waited out the storm, and now they were sweeping the valley, searching for her, for the box. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her, but beneath it, a new feeling was hardening resolve. She would not let Elias's death be for nothing. She would not let these men win. "There's a place," she said, her voice low and urgent, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Silver Sage Spring. It's about 5 miles east of here, a hidden spring in a box canyon. Elias and some of the other miners, the ones who didn't trust Sutter, they used it as a place to leave messages. If there is any other proof, any other witness, a letter might be there." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "You have to take me there." Atsidi didn't answer immediately. His gaze went past her, as if he were looking through the rock walls, reading the entire landscape. He weighed the position of the sun, hidden but palpable behind the thinning clouds. He considered the terrain he had drawn in the sand. "The snow is a danger," he said at last. "And a shield. Open ground is a killing ground. We will move only when the clouds give us cover." He looked at her. "We will walk in the shadow of the sky." It was a strange, poetic phrase, but she understood his meaning instantly. They would use the shifting shadows of the clouds as camouflage, moving from one patch of gray to the next, becoming ghosts on the white landscape. He stood up and began to gather his meager possessions, his water skin, his rope, the small pouches of herbs and tinder. He was going to do it. He was going to take her. He paused, then reached into his pack and pulled out a knife. The handle was smooth, pale bone, yellowed with age and use. The blade was steel, worn thin but honed to a razor's edge. It was a skinning knife, a tool for survival. He held it out to her, handle first. Lenora stared at it. "You are not a burden," he said, his voice flat, stating a fact. "But you are not a warrior. Do not try to fight. Use this to cut, to pry, to survive, to not be helpless." She took it. The weight of it in her palm was surprising. It was solid, real. It was not the weight of a weapon, but the weight of a choice. He was not just protecting her. He was acknowledging her role in her own survival. He was treating her as a partner, not a package to be delivered. A flicker of something gratitude, respect. A strange and powerful connection passed between them. Before they left, he performed one last ritual. He took the fire apart, stone by stone. He ground the remaining coals and ash into the sand until no trace remained. He used a branch to sweep the floor of the cave, erasing their footprints, blurring the signs of their brief occupation. He scattered pebbles and dust over the area. making it look as though it had been untouched for 1,000 years. Then he pushed aside the wolf pelt and gestured for her to go first. Lenora stepped out of the dark, warm cave and into the cold, bright, and deeply dangerous world. Atsidi followed, pulling the willows back into place behind them. It was as if the cave, and the night they had shared within it, had never existed. There was only the snow, the silence, and the hunt that had now, undoubtedly, begun. The journey to Cedar Crown Ridge was a slow, grueling ascent. The world was no longer a maelstrom of white, but a landscape of stark, blinding contrasts. A weak, watery sun had emerged, and its light on the fresh snow was brilliant enough to make the eyes ache. The air was thin and bitingly cold, but it carried new scents: the sharp, clean fragrance of pine and juniper, and the damp, earthy smell of melting snow. Water dripped from every rock and branch, a constant, gentle percussion that was the sound of the world slowly coming back to life. They moved with a caution that bordered on reverence, following the spines of ridges where the wind had scoured the snow thinnest. Atsidi moved like a spirit of the place, his moccasins finding silent purchase on slick rock and treacherous scree. Lenora followed, her city-bred senses overwhelmed. She had lived in Montana for 3 years, but she had never truly seen it. She had existed within its towns and on its dusty roads. But this raw, untamed wilderness was another country entirely. She was clumsy here, an intruder. Her worn leather boots, practical in the muddy streets of daybreak, were clumsy and loud on the trail. He taught her to walk, not with her feet, but with her whole body, to feel the ground through the soles of her boots, to anticipate the shift of a loose stone. It was a language her body struggled to learn. On a high-exposed section of the ridge, where the path narrowed to a mere suggestion beside a steep drop, her focus wavered. Her foot came down on a patch of snow, concealing a slick sheet of ice. The world tilted violently. A strangled cry escaped her lips as her feet went out from under her. There was a terrifying, weightless moment of falling. The gray sky and the white abyss below switching places in her vision. Then, an impact. Not the brutal crash she expected, but a solid, jarring force that stopped her descent. An arm, strong as an iron band, was locked around her waist. Atsidi had moved with impossible speed. He was braced against the rock face, his legs planted wide, holding her dead weight, all that separated her from the long fall into the valley. She was pressed against him, her cheek against the rough buckskin of his shoulder, her hands instinctively grabbing his arm. She could feel the hard, coiled muscles of his body, could smell the scent of wood smoke and cold, clean air that clung to him. For a breathless second, they remained frozen like that, a desperate tableau on the side of the mountain. He pulled her back, a single, controlled movement that set her on her feet on the solid path. She stumbled, her legs like jelly, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. She was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, her heart hammering as if trying to escape her ribs. She looked up at him, and their eyes met. His were dark, deep, and utterly focused. There was no judgment in them, no annoyance at her clumsiness. There was only a fierce, watchful intensity, and for a flicker of a second, something else, a spark of heat in the cold obsidian. He saw not a liability, but the wild, terrified pulse of the life he was fighting to protect. The moment stretched, held in that shared, breathless space. The vast, silent wilderness disappeared, and the world shrank to the few inches between their faces. The need to reclaim herself, to not be seen as a fragile burden, rose up in her, sharp and defiant. "I'm not weak," she said, her voice shaky but firm. A slow acknowledgement dawned in his eyes. He understood. He wasn't just saving a helpless woman. He was traveling with a survivor who had momentarily lost her footing. "I know," he replied, his voice a low murmur. And then he let her go. He didn't just release her. He deliberately took a half-step back, his hands dropping to his sides, ceding the space between them back to her. The gesture was more profound than any words of reassurance. It was a statement of respect. He was giving her back her own ground, her own control. The warmth of his hand lingered on her elbow for a moment before the cold air rushed in to reclaim it. They continued, but something had shifted. A new awareness existed between them. They began to develop a language that required no words. A slight, downward motion of his hand meant stop. 2 fingers pointed at his own eyes, then at a distant spot meant look. A flat palm held out behind him was an order to stay. To get her to crouch low as they crossed an open space, he would place his hand lightly on the back of her shoulder and press down. Each of these brief, functional touches was a current of energy. The brush of his fingers, the solid pressure of his palm, they were no longer the impersonal actions of a rescuer. They were points of connection, the weaving of a thin, warm thread of trust and reliance in the cold, dangerous air. He was her guide, her protector, but she was his eyes to the rear, his partner in this desperate flight. As the afternoon sun began to bleed toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pale rose and lavender, Atsidi stopped. He had flattened himself behind a gnarled, ancient juniper, and he gestured for her to do the same. She crawled beside him, her heart beginning its familiar, anxious rhythm. He pointed. She looked, but saw nothing but the deepening shadows in the valley below. Miles of snow and rock and trees. She squinted, searching. "There," he whispered, his voice so low it was barely a vibration in the air beside her. "By the dark stand of aspens." And then she saw it, a faint, almost invisible wisp of smoke, a delicate gray thread rising into the still evening air. So thin it was nearly mistaken for mist, a campfire, their campfire. The sight sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. They were down there, comfortable, warming their hands, eating a hot meal, and they were waiting. They knew she was somewhere in these mountains, and they were methodical, patient. They were wolves, and they had her scent. Atsidi watched the smoke for a long time, his face carved from stone. He was reading the situation, calculating the distance, the time. "They are 4, he said, more to himself than to her. "But they move like one man who is lost. They make noise. They leave their fire for all to see." He turned his eyes to her. "They are not of this land. This gives us an advantage." He began to teach her then. Not in a classroom, but on the living canvas of the earth. He was showing her how to use that advantage. He wasn't just showing her how to hide. He was showing her how to see. "The land speaks," he said, his voice a quiet counterpoint to the wind. "You must learn to listen." He pointed to a patch of rabbit grass near a rock. "The wind comes from the west, but this grass is bent to the east. Something passed here, moving against the wind, not long ago. A deer, maybe, or a man." He led her to a stream, its edges choked with ice, but its center still running, black and cold. He overturned a small, mossy stone at the water's edge. The underside was dark, wet, and teeming with tiny insects. "If this were dry," he explained, "it would mean someone had stepped here recently. Turning the stone, the sun has not yet had time to steal its moisture." He taught her to listen to the silence, the sudden absence of a jay's scolding call, the way the tiny, iridescent hummingbirds that darted among the junipers would vanish in an instant if a large presence disturbed the air. It was a language of ghosts and whispers, of subtle signs and profound meanings. She was a clumsy student, her senses dulled by a lifetime of ignoring such things. But she tried. She listened with an intensity that made her head ache. She was beginning to understand that his survival, and therefore her own, was not a matter of strength or weaponry, but of this deep, intimate knowledge. He did not fight the wilderness. He was a part of it, and to hunt him here was like trying to hunt the wind itself. Night fell with the swift, sudden finality of the high country. There was no lingering twilight, just a rapid draining of color from the world, leaving behind a stark landscape of black and silver under a canopy of impossibly bright stars. The cold returned, more intense than the night before. They needed shelter. Atsidi led her down from the ridge into a sheltered draw choked with cottonwoods, and there, almost completely hidden by a thicket of overgrown lilac, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It was a trapper's hovel, long abandoned. The walls were made of rough-hewn, unchinked logs, and the roof sagged dangerously in the middle. It was a wreck, but it was 4 walls and a roof. It was sanctuary. They slipped inside through the door, which hung from a single leather hinge. The air inside was musty and cold, smelling of damp earth, old rot, and the faint, musky scent of the animals that had used it for shelter since its human owner had vanished. There was a crude stone fireplace, a rickety table, and a built-in bunk filled with the remnants of a straw mattress. It was a ghost of a home. Atsidi set to work immediately, using the bone-handled knife to shave tinder from a dry log he found in the corner. Soon, a small, cautious fire was burning in the hearth. It was a cheerless, smoky fire, but it was heat. Outside, the weather was turning, the wind picked up, and a cold, sleety rain began to fall, hissing in the trees. And then Lenora heard a new sound. Plink, plonk, drip. The roof was leaking. A steady, monotonous drip of icy water was falling onto the packed earth floor near the bunk. She was soaked through from their journey, a damp chill clinging to her skin. She shivered, moving closer to the fire. Her heavy coat was a liability now, a wet blanket holding the cold against her. She had to take it off. She turned her back to him, a gesture of privacy in the small, one-room space, and shrugged out of the coat. She removed her wet wool bodice as well, leaving her in her thin chemise. She immediately wrapped herself in one of the dry, smoky-smelling furs Atsidi had been carrying. It was heavy and coarse, but it was warm. She huddled on the floor by the hearth, holding her hands out to the pathetic flames. They were still numb, her fingers stiff and clumsy. She felt him move behind her. He knelt, not beside her, but close enough for her to feel his presence. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took one of her hands. He cradled it in his own too, his rough, warm palms completely enveloping her smaller, colder one. He began to rub it gently, his thumbs working circles over her knuckles, bringing the life back into the frozen flesh. The sensation was a dull ache that slowly bloomed into a pins and needles tingle of returning warmth. She watched his hands. They were scarred and capable, the hands of a man who lived by his wits and his strength. And yet, his touch was careful, gentle. He was simply warming her fingers. There was no other intent. But it was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. She looked up from their joined hands to his face. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the dark, gaping maw of the doorway. His eyes narrowed, his ears attuned to the sounds of the night, the wind, the rattling door, the steady, rhythmic drip from the ceiling. He was both present with her, offering this small, profound comfort, and simultaneously far away, a sentinel standing guard over their fragile peace. The silence stretched, filled only by the fire's crackle and the dripping water. In that small, sheltered moment, with the vast, dangerous night held at bay, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. "I used to laugh," she said, her voice quiet, almost a surprise to herself. "All the time. Elias, he was a fool, in the best way. He once tried to fix a church pew and ended up nailing the preacher's coat to the floor. He didn't realize it until the benediction. We laughed so hard that night, we couldn't breathe. I can't remember the last time I laughed." The memory was so clear, so vivid. It was like a shard of glass in her heart. Atsidi said nothing for a long time. He simply continued to warm her hand, his steady touch an anchor. She thought he hadn't heard, or hadn't cared. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "My mother," he said, his eyes still on the darkness outside. She had songs for the rain, when the land was dry and the corn was wilting. She would stand on the mesa and sing. The old songs. They asked the clouds to weep. Sometimes they did. He paused, his thumb stilling on her hand. The soldiers came in a dry season. She sang for 3 days, but the rain did not come. He did not need to say more. His loss, his grief, was as vast and silent as the landscape outside. It was a different kind of pain from her own, older, deeper, a grief not just for a person, but for a whole world that was vanishing. They sat there in the quiet, her hand in his. The rain fell harder, drumming on the sagging roof, each drop like a soft knock on the door of their shared solitude. Outside, the world was awash of darkness and water. Inside, by the flickering firelight, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of a laughing miner and a singing woman. It was a silence that held 2 lifetimes, 2 griefs, and the fragile, unspoken promise that they were no longer entirely alone in the dark. They reached Silver Sage Spring at noon the next day. The journey had been a silent one, the shared confessions of the previous night having created not a comfortable intimacy, but a fragile, charged space between them. They moved through a world of dripping pines and snow-softened canyons, each acutely aware of the other, of the histories that now lay exposed between them. The spring was hidden, as Lenora had promised, tucked away at the back of a narrow box canyon whose entrance was almost completely obscured by a thicket of red osier dogwood. Inside the canyon, the world changed. The air was warmer, sheltered from the wind. A fine, green moss, impossibly vibrant against the snow, clung to the southern faces of the canyon walls. And the spring itself was a miracle. It wasn't a pool, but a sheet of the purest, clearest water that seemed to well up directly from a fissure in a flat, gray slab of rock, flowing over it like a pane of liquid glass before gathering in a small, pebble-lined creek that vanished into the trees. The air smelled of wet stone and clean, living water. It felt like a church. For a moment, seeing the pristine beauty of the place, Lenora felt a surge of hope. This was a secret place, a sanctuary. Surely it had remained untouched. "The loose rock," she said, her voice a low, reverent whisper. "Just there, to the left of the falls, behind the maidenhair ferns." She pointed to a section of the rock wall where a collection of smaller stones seemed to have been piled. A natural-looking scree slope. It was the perfect hiding spot, a place no one would look twice at. But as they drew closer, the hope in her chest shriveled and died. The rocks had been disturbed. It was not the random scattering of a rock slide or the work of an animal. The stones had been pulled away from the wall with a focused, human violence, tossed aside carelessly. Behind them, a dark, hollowed-out space was visible, an empty cavity in the rock. The post office was empty. The letters were gone. "No," Lenora breathed. The word was a puff of white in the cold air. She rushed forward, falling to her knees in the snow and mud before the violated hollow. She reached into the cold, dark space, her fingers searching frantically, but they met only damp stone and grit. He had been here. Sutter had been here. He knew. He had known all along. Her shoulders slumped. It was over. Whatever proof, whatever corroboration she had hoped to find, was gone. Taken by the man who had murdered her husband. He was not just a killer. He was a ghost who was always one step ahead, erasing his tracks, erasing the truth. As she pulled her hand back, her fingers brushed against something small and metallic in the mud at the base of the rock. She picked it up. It was a small piece of stamped brass, no bigger than a thumbnail, with a broken pin on the back. It was dirty, but when she rubbed it clean against her sleeve, she could make out 2 letters, elegantly embossed on its surface. B.S. Barnaby Sutter. It wasn't a clue he had missed. It was a message he had left, a piece of a custom tie tack or a lapel pin, perhaps dropped with casual, arrogant purpose. It was a statement. I was here. I own this. You are too late. Lenora's hand closed around the small piece of metal, its sharp edges digging into her palm. The cold rage from the day before returned. But this time, it was different. It was colder, heavier, laced with the bitter taste of defeat. She felt Atsidis' presence behind her, a silent, watchful shadow. He had seen the empty cache, had seen the rage and despair on her face. He knelt, not beside her, but a respectful distance away. He looked at the disturbed rocks, his eyes missing nothing. "He does not move like a man of the mountains," Atsidi said, his voice a low observation. "He moves like a wolf that has been taught to hunt by men. He is clumsy, But he is thorough. Lenora said nothing. She just stared at the empty hole, the brass token a burning coal in her fist. What was the point of going on? What good was her one small box of proof against a man who was everywhere, who could steal the very words of the dead from their hiding places in the rock? I have seen this before. Atsidi continued, his voice quiet, drawing her from her spiral of despair. This kind of thoroughness. When I was a boy, I guided the bluecoats, the soldiers. The confession was so quiet, so matter-of-fact. It took a moment for the words to register. Lenora turned her head slowly and looked at him. His face was impassive, but his eyes were fixed on a distant point, a place in his memory she could not see. They came to the reservation in the moon of the falling leaves, he said. They brought papers from their great father in Washington. The papers promised peace. They promised food for the winter, medicine for the sick, blankets for the old ones. He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. In return, they wanted guides, men who knew the canyons, the high passes, men who could lead them through the lands of the Sioux and the Cheyenne, our ancient enemies. He fell silent, but the story hung unfinished in the cold air. Lenora knew the rest. It was a story she had heard 100 times, in 100 different variations, since coming west, a story of promises made and promises broken. The elders debated. Atsidi went on. Some said it was a trap, that to help the whites against one enemy was to invite them to become a greater one. Others looked at the children with the hollows in their cheeks. They looked at the empty stores of corn. They said, "What is honor to a starving child?" So I went. A few of us did. We took their silver dollars and their sacks of flour. We guided them. He finally turned his eyes to her. In their depths, she saw a flicker of an old, deep wound. It was not guilt. It was something heavier, a profound, world-weary sorrow. We showed them the way, he said, and they brought not peace, but swords. They made war where there had been none. The food ran out, the blankets were thin. The peace never came. His story settled over Lenora, a weight of history that was far greater than her own. She saw him then not just as Atsidi, the silent man who had saved her, but as a part of a much larger tragedy. He, too, was a survivor of a massacre, one that was slower, quieter, but no less brutal than the one that had taken her husband. His grief and her grief, his guilt and her innocence, his people's loss and her personal loss. They were no longer separate things. They were two great, grinding sheets of ice, crashing together in the silence of the canyon. A cold dread began to seep into her bones, a dread that had nothing to do with Barnaby Sutter. A terrible question was forming in her mind, a question she was terrified to ask, but one she knew she must. "The soldiers," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "The ones you guided. Where did you take them?" Atsidi's gaze did not waver. "Through the high country, to the east." "What was it called?" she insisted, her voice rising, becoming sharp with a dawning horror. "The pass, the main route you showed them. What was its name?" He looked at her, his expression still a mask, but a flicker of confusion entered his eyes. He could not know the significance of the question. To him, it was just a name, a place on a map he carried in his head. He answered with a simple, brutal honesty she was coming to know as his nature. Pale Drum Gap. The world stopped. The sound of the water, the whisper of the wind, the cry of a distant bird, it all ceased. There was only the name, echoing in the vast silent canyon of her skull. Pale Drum Gap. The name from the assayer's report. The name of the remote, notoriously unstable section of the mountains where the syndicate had opened their new mine. The place where Elias and 4 other men had been buried under 1,000 tons of rock. "My husband," Lenora said, and the words felt like they were being ripped from her throat. They were dead things, devoid of all emotion. "My husband died there." The silence that descended then was absolute. It was a silence that was heavier than rock, colder than the snow. It pressed down on them, suffocating them. Atsidi's face, for the first time since she had met him, changed. The impassive mask shattered. Something akin to shock, then horror, then a deep, profound agony moved across his features. He had not known. He could not have known. But the fact remained. The path he had shown the army, the path he had opened for a sack of flour and a false promise, had, years later, led directly to her husband's grave. He had not lit the fuse, but he had helped build the road to the bomb. A lone hawk, which had been circling on the high thermal currents, let out a single, piercing cry. The sound ripped through the silence, a raw, desolate shriek that sounded like a judgment from the sky. Atsidi looked from her face, pale and stricken, down to the ground. He seemed to shrink, the proud, solid strength draining out of him, leaving him looking older, worn down to the bone by the weight of a history he could not escape. He reached to his belt and slowly, deliberately, drew his knife, the one with the handle of pale, smooth bone. He did not hold it like a weapon. He laid it gently on a flat, mossy rock between them, the honed steel blade gleaming dully in the pale light. He slid it across the rock until the handle was pointing toward her. "The anger in you is a fire," he said, his voice rough, thick with an emotion she could not name. "It is a good fire. It keeps you warm. It keeps you alive. But if you hold it in, it will turn to iron in your heart. It will make you hard. It will make you heavy. It will drown you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible sadness. "If you need to strike, use your words. Scream at me. Curse me. But do not let your anger become iron." Lenora stared at the knife. It would be so easy to pick it up, so easy to let the cold rage in her belly find an object for its fury. He was the beginning of the trail that led to Elias's death. He was a link in the chain. She could hate him. It would be simple. It would be clean. But as she looked at his face, she saw not an enemy, but a man as trapped by the past as she was. His guilt was a canyon. Hers was a fissure, but they were both cracks in the same broken earth. Picking up that knife would not bring Elias back. It would not bring the papers back from Sutter's hands. It would only destroy the one person who had shown her any kindness, the one person who stood between her and a certain death in the wilderness. It would only leave her alone. She did not take the knife. She drew a long, shuddering breath, the first she had taken since he had spoken the name of the pass. "I don't need to strike," she said, her voice a hoarse rasp. "I need to live. I need the truth to be heard." She looked him directly in the eye, her own grief a raw, open wound. "And I need a guide." Atsidi held her gaze. He saw not forgiveness in her eyes. It was too soon, too raw for that. He saw something far more powerful, a choice to move forward, to carry the weight of the past without being crushed by it. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a promise, an oath. He would not just guide her. He would see this through. He would help her carry the truth. "Fort Hallett," he said. It was not a question. It was a destination. "There is an army post 50 miles from here. They will have a telegraph. A federal marshal. Take me there," she said. "Take me and the box to Fort Hallett." He stood up, leaving the knife on the rock. A test. A final choice for her to make. She stood up as well, turning her back on it. She looked out of the canyon, toward the distant, snow-capped peaks. The world was still beautiful, still deadly. Everything had changed, and nothing had changed. They stood at the edge of the sacred, violated spring, a moment ago. A fragile thread had been weaving them together. Now, a chasm separated them. They were a full arm's length apart, but the distance felt as wide and as deep as a lifetime. They were no longer just a man and a woman fleeing a common enemy. They were two ghosts, bound together by a tragedy that had begun long before they had ever met. The cold was a blade, and the night was its forge. It was a cold that had weight, a living entity that pressed in from the dark, seeking the smallest crack. Wind poured down from the unseen heights of the snow-cut basin, an invisible, screaming river of ice. It found every weakness in the trapper's hovel, whistling through the chinks between the logs, rattling the door on its one good hinge. The old, half-rotted wood of the structure groaned in protest. a constant, high-pitched creaking like a ship being broken apart by a frozen sea. In the crude stone hearth, the fire was a failing enterprise. It had shrunk to a small, stubborn knot of embers. A single glowing cat's eye in the vast, devouring darkness of the cabin. It offered little light and even less warmth. Lenora sat huddled on the floor, as close to the embers as she dared. The buffalo robe Atsidi had given her was wrapped tight around her, but the cold crept in from below, seeping up from the packed earth and from above, where the leaking roof had left patches of damp that now felt like sheets of ice. She was trembling. It was not the light shiver of a chill, but a deep, racking tremor that began in her marrow and shook her whole frame. The day had taken its toll. The long, desperate march after the devastating discovery at Silver Sage Spring had drained her physical strength, and the confrontation, the revelation of Pale Drum Gap, had hollowed out her soul. Her shoulder was a dull, throbbing map of pain from her fall 2 days prior. Her lips were cracked and raw, stinging with every ragged breath. Atsidi sat on the other side of the dying fire. He was, as always, a figure of profound stillness, his back against the opposite wall, his long legs folded. He had been staring into the embers, but she knew he was not resting. He was listening to the wind, to the protesting cabin, to the vast, dangerous silence of the wilderness outside. The chasm that had opened between them at the spring was still there. A silence, thicker and colder than the night air, filled the space between them. He was the man who had saved her life, and he was the man who had, however and innocently, helped pave the road to her husband's grave. The two facts warred in her mind, leaving her exhausted and confused. But as the cold deepened, as the night wore on, one fact began to overwhelm all others. He was here. He was warm. He was alive. And she was so cold, and so utterly alone. She looked up, her gaze cutting through the gloom, and met his. He had been watching her. His face, carved by the fire's dim glow, was unreadable. She held his gaze. There was no coyness in it, no artifice. Her eyes were stripped bare of everything but the raw, elemental truth of her exhaustion and her fear. It was a look that bypassed their histories, their races, their griefs. It was the look of one human being, at the absolute end of their endurance, looking at another. The cabin groaned, and a fine spray of snow hissed through a crack above her head. She flinched. When she spoke, her voice was a dry rasp, a sound so quiet it was almost swallowed by the wind. "Don't leave me tonight." He did not move. His eyes remained locked on hers. He was waiting, parsing the words. She took a shuddering breath, the cold burning her lungs. The tremor in her body worsened, but a new, desperate resolve firmed her voice. "Don't stop," she whispered, the words thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was fear, but it was also a profound, aching need. "I need this." It was a confession of a terrible weakness, and the first true show of strength she had managed. She was not asking him to be her lover. She was not asking him to fix her. She was asking him to be a bulwark. She was asking him, simply, to not let her be alone in the dark. She was asking for his warmth, his presence, his sheer, solid reality, to stand between her and the ghosts and the cold that were threatening to consume her. For a long, agonizing moment, he remained still. He was a man of the desert, a man who understood survival. He understood that the cold of the soul could kill as surely as the cold of the night. Then, in one fluid, silent motion, he rose and crossed the 3 feet of packed earth that separated them. He knelt before her. He was a shadow, a mountain of a man blotting out the dying fire. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a palpable, living force. He slowly lifted one hand, his calloused, rough fingers spread. It was a question, asked in the language of pure gesture. He was giving her a last chance to retreat into the cold safety of their separateness. He laid his palm against her cheek. The contact was a shock, a jolt of pure, unadulterated warmth that was almost painful. His hand was rough as sandstone, scarred and hard, but it was the warmest thing she had ever felt. It covered her entire cheek. his thumb resting near the corner of her eye. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. A long, shuddering sigh that was almost a sob escaped her lips, and she leaned into his hand. An involuntary movement, a flower turning to the only sun it could find. Her eyes closed. Then, with a small, conscious movement of her own, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. It was an answer, an agreement, a surrender that was, in itself, a form of profound, gentle trust. They stayed that way for a long moment, forehead to forehead, breathing the same small cloud of air. The world reduced to this single point of contact, the heavy buffalo robe, which she had been clutching with a death grip, fell loose. It slipped from her shoulders and pooled in her lap, a silent, heavy leaf falling in the darkness. His other hand came up, cradling the other side of her face. He held her head gently, his thumbs stroking the high, cold curve of her cheekbones. His movements were slow, measured, deeply respectful. Each small shift of his hands seemed to wait for her breath, to ask permission. He was not taking, he was offering. He was so close. The scent of him, pine smoke, cold air, and something else, something wild and earthy. Like ozone and dust filled her senses. He was solid. He was real, with infinite care. His fingers threaded into her hair, brushing the damp, tangled strands back from her temple, tucking them behind her ear. The simple, domestic gesture undid her. The warmth of his hand trailed from her ear, down the sensitive, cold, tense cord of her neck, to the bruised, aching muscle of her shoulder. He didn't grope or demand. His touch was a question, a soothing, a statement. "I am here. I feel your pain." A long, low sigh broke from her, a sound of relief so deep it vibrated in her chest. It was the unwinding of a spring that had been coiled too tight for too long. It was the release of months of grief, of terror, of a loneliness so profound she hadn't even known its name until this moment. He tilted his head, a fractional movement, his breath, warm and tasting of the faint, bitter tea he had made earlier, brushed against her lips. It was a final, silent question. She answered by breathing in, a small, accepting motion, and then his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of fire, it was a kiss of warmth. It was unhurried, it was soft, hesitant at first, a simple, gentle pressure of his firm, warm mouth against her cold, chapped lips. It was a kiss that offered life, that shared breath. It was a promise to stay. Then something shifted. The shared warmth kindled. It was like watching an ember, when breathed upon, glow from dull red to bright, living gold. It was the slow, inevitable catch of fire in dry wood. The kiss deepened, not with force, but with a powerful, mutual, and desperate recognition. A small, broken sound came from her throat, and her hands, which had been lying cold and useless in her lap, came up. They didn't claw at him. They found the rough, laced edges of his buckskin shirt and gripped them. She held on, as if he were a rock and she was being swept away by a cold, dark river. She pulled him closer, not with aggression, but with the undeniable gravity of her profound, simple need. The kiss broke, but they did not part. They remained where they were, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, their hearts hammering a wild, mismatched rhythm. He shifted, his body moving from a kneel to sit beside her, pulling her against his side. He was the rock, and she was the one taking shelter in its lee. With one arm still around her, he reached for the heavy buffalo robe. He shook it out and, in a single, practiced motion, wrapped it around them both. He cocooned them in the thick, smoky fur, pulling her tight against the solid wall of his chest. He created a new sanctuary, a small, warm cave of their own in the middle of the dark, cold hovel. She turned, pressing her face into the curve of his neck and shoulder, inhaling his scent. She was trembling, but it was no longer from the cold. It was the aftershock of contact, of solace, of no longer being alone. He said nothing. He simply held her. One of his hands began to stroke her back, a steady, rhythmic, comforting motion, up and down, from her shoulder to her waist. It was a wordless language. It said, "You are safe. I am here. Rest." She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart under her cheek. A slow, solid thump. Thump, thump. That was the sound of life itself. And her own heart, in response, began to slow, to match its rhythm. There were no declarations, no promises of a future. There were only the small, essential sounds of two people finding refuge, the whisper of her breath against his skin, his own deep, steady breathing, the soft rustle of the fur as he adjusted his hold. Just then, the wind, as if furious at their small, stolen warmth, slammed the cabin. A gust shrieked through the logs with the sound of a living thing, and the entire structure groaned, vibrating under the assault. It was a brutal reminder of the world outside, of Barnaby Sutter, of the cold, of death. Lenora tensed instantly. A small, frightened gasp choked in her throat. The world was still there. It was still hunting her, instinctively. Atsidi's arm tightened. His embrace became a shield. He pulled her more securely against him, angling his own body to take the brunt of the icy draft that had pierced their cocoon. He held her fast, his body an unmoving wall of muscle and warm buckskin. She clutched his shirt again, her voice a muffled, desperate whisper against his shoulder. "Don't stop, please don't!" This time, the plea was different. It was not just about the cold. It was about this connection, this fortress of two. "Don't let this moment end. Don't let the world back in." He answered her, not with words, but with a steady, gentle pressure. His hand on her back never faltered in its rhythm. His hold did not slacken. He pressed his lips, warm and firm, against her hair. A simple grounding, profound reassurance. His embrace was a silent, solemn vow. "I will not stop. I am here." The night wore on. The wind howled itself into a weary moan. The fire in the hearth finally died, the cat's eye closing for good, leaving them in a darkness that was absolute. The cabin grew bitterly cold, but inside the heavy robe, a small, shared climate was maintained. They did not sleep. They drifted in a state between, a profound rest that was also a state of heightened awareness. It was the shared, watchful trust of two soldiers in a foxhole, guarding each other's sleep, sometime in the deep, ink-black hours before dawn, when the cold was at its most profound. Her hand found his in the darkness beneath the fur. Her fingers, no longer cold, tentatively interlaced with his. His rough, calloused hand closed around hers, a firm, strong, and deeply comforting grip. They lay like that in the dark, two survivors, holding hands. The past was a landscape of ghosts. The future was a cliff in the dark. But for these few, stolen hours, they were not a widow and a scout. They were not their separate griefs. They were just two people, breathing in unison, who had finally found their breath. There was no dawn, only a slow, reluctant leaking of gray light into the world. It was not a sunrise. It was a surrender. Atsidi was awake before the light, not because he had slept, but because he had been listening to the night's subtle shift in rhythm. The wind had died, and the silence it left behind was wrong. It was a heavy, watchful silence. The birds were not singing. He rose from the furs in a single, silent motion, leaving Lenora in the deep pocket of warmth they had shared. He moved to the doorway, a ghost in the gloom, and peered through a tiny gap. What he saw made the muscles in his back and shoulders bunch into knots of solid stone. Hoof prints. They were everywhere. A lattice work of overlapping circles and crescents in the snow. A comprehensive, damning geometry. They had not been made by a passing patrol. The riders had circled the cabin, again and again, studying it, containing it, a noose, drawn tight in the snow. He turned and crossed back to Lenora. He did not speak. He laid a hand on her shoulder, a firm, urgent pressure. Her eyes opened instantly, the soft, trusting warmth from the night's shared darkness immediately replaced by the sharp, cold glint of fear as she saw his face. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the door. Understanding was instant. The fragile peace of the night shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Panic, cold and electric, jolted through her. But something else rose with it, the hardened resolve from the day before. She was not the same woman who had collapsed in the snow. Her first thought was for the box. It sat on the rickety table. A simple, damning piece of evidence. The cabin offered few hiding places. Her eyes darted around the small, squalid space. In the corner, by the cold hearth, was a small, open-topped wooden barrel. It was half filled with the coarse, grayish salt the trapper had used for curing hides. It was a pathetic option, but it was the only one. She snatched the box, wrapped it in a piece of oily canvas she found on the floor, and shoved it deep into the barrel, burying it beneath a heavy layer of salt. She smoothed the top, her hands shaking slightly, praying it looked undisturbed. Atsidi, meanwhile, was at the back of the cabin, where a small, shuttered window looked out onto a steep, scree-covered slope. He worked the rotted shutter open with a silent, careful prying of his knife. He looked up the slope, his eyes scanning the loose rocks. Then he took his yucca rope, uncoiled a length of it, and tied it securely to a large, precariously balanced rock near the top of the scree. He threaded the rope back down and through the window, laying the loose end on the floor. It was a simple trap. A trap not for the body, but for the ear. The sound of a man clearing his throat, startlingly close, made them both freeze. Then, a voice, dripping with a false, cheerful authority, cut through the morning stillness. "Mrs. Vale Lenora Barnaby Sutter, I know you're in there. We saw the smoke from your fire last night. Come on out. We just want to talk. Ensure you're safe." The voice was smooth as polished river stone, and just as cold. It was the voice of a spider, politely inviting a fly into its parlor. Lenora's blood ran cold. She looked at Atsidi. His face was a mask of lethal concentration. He pointed to the wall beside the door, the safest place from a stray bullet. She flattened herself against it, her heart a frantic drum against the rough logs. "No need to be shy." "Lenora," Sutter called again, his tone taking on a hard, impatient edge. "The game's over. I know you have the box. Let's not make this any more difficult than it needs to be." Silence. The men outside were getting restless. The crunch of boots in the snow told of them fanning out, surrounding the cabin completely. Atsidi crept to the door, his knife in his hand. He was no longer a guide. He was a cornered wolf. "Last chance. Widow." Sutter's voice was a snarl now. "I have 4 guns out here. You have a half-frozen Apache. The arithmetic is not on your side." Lenora took a deep breath. The anger, the cold iron she had refused to let into her heart at the spring, was there now, not as a poison, but as a fuel. She would not die cowering. She pushed herself off the wall and strode to the center of the room. She faced the door, her chin held high. "I know what you did, Sutter," she called out, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I have my husband's notebook. It's all in there, the odd hours, the extra charges. You murdered him. You murdered them all." A heavy, dangerous silence followed. She had taken his polite fiction and ripped it to shreds. She had spoken the truth into the cold morning air, and now it could not be unspoken. The door exploded inward. It was kicked off its single hinge with a deafening crash, slamming into the opposite wall. Barnaby Sutter stood framed in the doorway, a stark, black silhouette against the blinding white snow. He was a tall, well-dressed man, even here in the wilderness, wearing a long, tailored coat. He had a neatly trimmed beard and cold, intelligent eyes. Behind him, 3 other men, their faces obscured by scarves, wrapped high against the cold, fanned out, their pistols drawn and leveled. Sutter smiled. A thin, cruel slash of a smile. "Well," he said, his voice soft and menacing, "it seems the widow knows far too much for her own good." In that split second, as all eyes were on Lenora, Atsidi moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a blur of buckskin and focused violence. He lunged, not for Sutter, but for the end of the yucca rope lying on the floor. With a powerful, upward heave, he yanked it. High on the slope outside, the large rock teetered, pulled from its perch. It crashed down onto the scree, starting a miniature avalanche. A cascade of smaller rocks and frozen earth tumbled down the hill. A sudden, deafening roar of grinding stone. It was the perfect distraction. The three henchmen outside instinctively spun toward the sound, their guns coming up, expecting an attack from the rear. One of Sutter's men, a lanky man who had been creeping around the side of the cabin, was directly in Atsidi's line of sight through the open doorway. Atsidi didn't hesitate. He held the coiled end of his rope in one hand, with a flick of his wrist, a movement as fast and deadly as a striking rattlesnake. He sent a loop of the coarse rope flying. It snaked through the air, uncoiling, and settled perfectly around the lanky man's ankles. Atsidi dug in his heels and pulled back with all his strength. The man's feet were yanked out from under him. He yelped in surprise and crashed face first into the snow with a heavy, ignominious thud. The world erupted in chaos. A gunshot, deafening in the enclosed space, blasted from Sutter's pistol. The bullet ripped through the air where Atsidi had been a second before, burying itself in the log wall with a meaty thump. The other men, realizing the rock slide was a ruse, opened fire. Bullets tore through the flimsy cabin walls, splintering wood, punching holes of daylight into the gloom. The air was instantly thick with the acrid, choking smell of black powder smoke. Atsidi had already thrown Lenora to the floor behind the flimsy table, covering her with his own body. He grabbed the bone-handled knife from his belt. This was a fight he could not win with guns. It had to be won with speed and terror. He shoved Lenora toward the back window. "Go through the cut," he yelled over the din. "Don't stop." He rose into a low crouch and exploded out the front door, a terrifying, ululating cry ripping from his throat. He was no longer a quiet guide. He was Hashkitsa, angry stone, an avenging spirit of the mountain. He crashed into one of the gunmen, the bone knife flashing. The man screamed and went down, clutching a wounded arm. Lenora scrambled to the back window. She could hear the panicked shouts, the roar of gunfire. She threw her leg over the sill and tumbled out into the snow, the precious box forgotten for the moment. Her only thought was Atsidi's command. Go Juniper Cut was a narrow fissure in the rock face behind the cabin, a place barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. She plunged into it, the rough, cold stone scraping at her sides. Behind her, the gunshots faltered, replaced by Sutter's furious, bellowing voice. "Don't let them get away! They're in the rocks!" A bullet whined past the entrance to the cut, striking sparks from the granite. A moment later, Atsidi was there, practically throwing himself into the narrow space. There was a dark, wet slash across his left bicep, his buckskin sleeve soaked with blood. "Keep moving," he grunted, pushing her ahead of him. They scrambled through the tight passage. It was a dark, claustrophobic tunnel of rock that twisted and turned, shielding them from the gunfire. They emerged 50 yards later on a high ledge overlooking a steep, wooded ravine. "The rocks!" Atsidi gasped, pointing to a massive, fractured slab of granite that was perched precariously on the edge of the ledge. "Help me!" Together, they put their shoulders to the cold stone. It was immense, immovable, but it was balanced on a knife edge of crumbling shale. They heaved, their feet slipping in the snow, their breath coming in ragged, burning bursts. The rock groaned. It shifted an inch. Sutter and two of his men appeared at the far end of the cut, their figures small and dark. Sutter raised his pistol. "One last push," Atsidi roared. They threw every last ounce of their strength into it. With a deafening crack, the shale beneath the great rock gave way. The massive slab tilted, hung for a terrifying, weightless second, and then plunged over the side of the ledge. It did not just fall. It shattered as it hit the steep slope below, triggering a real avalanche this time. A river of rock, snow, and splintered trees roared down into the ravine, a force of geological fury that would take a decade to settle. The path was gone, They were cut off. They stood on the ledge, chests heaving, watching the dust and snow settle. On the other side of the newly formed chasm, Barnaby Sutter stood shaking with rage. His fine coat was torn, his face black with fury. He couldn't shoot them. They were out of range, and the air was too thick with dust. But his voice carried across the gap. A raw, furious promise. "You can't run forever. Vale," he screamed, his voice cracking. "There's no place you can go where the syndicate's arm can't reach. I'll have the law on you. I'll have you branded a kidnapper and him a murderer. I'll hunt you to the gates of hell." Atsidi pulled Lenora back from the ledge, out of sight. The adrenaline was fading, and a gray wave of exhaustion was washing over her. She looked at Atsidi. The front of his sleeve was now soaked crimson. "You're hurt," she said, her voice flat with shock. He glanced down at his arm, as if noticing it for the first time. "It is a scratch." "It is not a scratch," she countered, her voice gaining a sharp, authoritative edge she hadn't known it possessed. "Sit." To her surprise, he did, slumping down with his back against a rock, a faint sheen of sweat on his face. The wound was a long, ugly gash, oozing blood. Not from a bullet, but from a piece of flying metal, a ricochet, or perhaps a splinter from the door hinge. She didn't hesitate. There was no time for modesty or second thoughts. She knelt, lifted the hem of her heavy wool skirt, and found the edge of her innermost petticoat. With a savage, determined rip, she tore a long, clean strip of white linen from it. Her hands, as she worked, were perfectly steady. The trembling woman of the night before was gone, replaced by a pragmatist forged in gunfire. She wrapped the strip of cloth tightly around his bicep, creating a pressure bandage. His muscles were hard as stone beneath her touch. He watched her, his dark eyes intense, his face pale beneath its tan. Their roles had reversed. Now, she was the caregiver, her touch focused and sure. "We need to get to Bishop's Ferry," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Cross the Madison, get to the fort." "We need horses," she replied, tying off the bandage with a firm, practical nod. "There is a way station, an old one, 2 miles from here. Sometimes," he said, breathing heavily. "Outlaws leave tired horses and take fresh ones. We might be lucky." They were. The abandoned station was a collection of collapsed sod buildings and a single, sway-backed stable that was still standing. Inside, they found 2 horses, lean, tough-looking Mustangs, left behind by a previous traveler. They were not fine animals, but they were strong, and they were their only hope. They were riding east, keeping to the shelter of the trees, when they saw her. She was a figure from another time, a woman who looked as tough and enduring as the ancient, wind-twisted junipers. She was leading a pack mule laden with supplies, and she stood in the middle of the trail, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of her arm, watching them approach. She had iron-gray hair tied back in a practical bun, and a face so weathered it looked like a map of the territory. "You're moving fast for folks who ain't being chased," the woman said, her voice a gravelly boom. It was not a question. "We have urgent business at the fort," Lenora replied, her hand resting near the butt of the rifle Atsidi had taken from one of the downed gunmen. The woman's eyes took in every detail, their worn clothes, the fresh bandage on Atsidi's arm, the desperate, hunted look in their eyes. "Urgent business with the syndicate, I'd wager," the woman said, and her gaze softened slightly. "I'm Maeve Hollis. I run supplies out to the free prospectors. The ones the syndicate ain't squeezed out yet. I know a miner's widow when I see one, and I know what Sutter does to folks who get in his way." Lenora and Atsidi exchanged a look. In this vast, empty wilderness, they had stumbled upon an ally. "We have proof," Lenora said, her voice low. "Proof he murdered my husband and his partners." Maeve nodded slowly, her expression grim. "Then you'll need more than luck. You'll need an honest man. Most of the officers at the fort are on the syndicate's payroll. They'll clap you in irons and lose your proof before you can say boo." She spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "But you're in luck. Lieutenant Rowan was transferred in last month. He's a straight arrow. Can't be bought. If you can get your proof to him, and only to him, you might have a chance. The information was a lifeline, a name, a single point of hope in a sea of corruption. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollis," Lenora said, her voice thick with a gratitude that was almost painful. "Don't thank me yet," Maeve grunted, pulling her mule aside to let them pass. "Just live long enough to see that bastard Sutter dance at the end of a rope. Now get your burning daylight." They spurred their new horses, heading east with a renewed, desperate purpose. Their flight was no longer a panicked scramble. It was a strategy, a timeline, a brutal, relentless rhythm dictated by survival. Night was for the forest, where the deep shadows of the pines would hide them from the moon. Dawn was for the water, fording the icy, shallow tributaries of the Madison while the morning mist still clung to the surface, obscuring them from sight. Noon was for the rock, finding a deep crevice or a sandstone overhang where they could rest the horses and themselves, invisible from above. While the sun was high and the world was exposed, their journey became a frantic, whispered conversation with the land. Every movement was measured. Every moment was a calculation. Every beat of their shared, exhausted hearts was a drum, marking the dwindling time, counting down the miles to Fort Hallett. The high plains wind had a new voice. For 2 days, it had been a howl of nature, a thing of ice and stone. Now, it carried a sound that was utterly alien, a long, mournful cry that echoed across the grasslands from the east, the whistle of a steam locomotive. It was the sound of the world they were fleeing, the sound of progress and iron and the syndicate's limitless reach. Barnaby Sutter, it was clear, was not a man to rely on simple thugs. He had access to the telegraph lines that ran beside that track. He had money. The men hunting them now would be different. Not just hot-headed gunmen, but trackers. Railroad detectives who knew how to hunt men who followed the lines. And worse, as Atsidi had surmised from the tracks back at the cabin, a man who thought ahead, a man who would be waiting for them. A man, perhaps, like a former Pinkerton, who understood the cold arithmetic of pursuit and capture. They were running out of land. The chase had become a desperate, agonizing race to the last great obstacle, the Madison River. They reached Bishop's Ferry as the sun was a bleeding smear in the west. And their last, fragile hope turned to ash. The ferry was a smoking ruin. The thick log pier had been burned to the waterline, its pylons still glowing like hellish red eyes in the gathering dusk. The ferry itself, a simple flat-bottomed barge, was half sunk on the far side, its surface blackened and charred. But the worst of it was the cable. The thick, braided steel guide wire that had spanned the river was gone. A section of it lay coiled and tangled on their bank like a nest of dead, black snakes, the other end dropping uselessly into the fast, dark, and impossibly cold water. Sutter, or his new, more methodical hunters, had been here first. They had not just blocked the crossing, they had obliterated it. Lenora's shoulders slumped. This was the end. The river was 100 yards of churning, icy death. To the north and south, it entered sheer walled canyons. This ferry had been the only crossing for 50 miles. "He's trapped us," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. Atsidi stood at the water's edge, his face a mask of grim calculation. He looked at the water, at the sky, at his own wounded arm. The makeshift bandage was dark with seepage. He was feverish. She could see it in the unnatural brightness of his eyes. He uncoiled his yucca rope. "I will swim," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I will take the rope. You will follow, holding it." "You'll never make it," she said, her voice sharp with a new, pragmatic terror. "The water, it's too cold. Your arm, you'll be dead in 5 minutes." "Then I will be dead in 5 minutes," he replied, his tone flat. He was already tying one end around his waist. "There is no other way." "Yes, there is." Her eyes were darting around, frantic, searching. They landed on a pile of charred, but still solid, pine logs from the ferryman's burned cabin. Then on their saddlebags, a raft. Those logs, we can lash them together. They will sink, Atsidi said, not looking at her, his fingers working at a knot. They are waterlogged. Not if we have floats, she insisted, her mind racing. She had seen mule skinners do it, and farmhands. Your water skins, we empty them of water and fill them with air, and the gut casings. For the jerky, if we tie them off, inflate them, we can lash them under the logs. It's what they do. It will be enough. It has to be. She pointed to the box, which she had retrieved from the salt barrel in the chaos of the cabin and now held clutched in her hand. We have to protect this. He stopped his work on the knot. He looked at the logs, at her, at the water skins on their horses. It was a desperate, almost mad plan. A few bladders of air against the full, crushing force of the Madison. But it was a plan, and it was better than his, which was a simple, drawn-out suicide. He gave a single, sharp nod. It took them a precious, terrifying hour. Their hands clumsy with cold and haste in the fading light. They lashed 3 of the most buoyant logs together with rawhide strips, creating a small, unstable triangle. They emptied their canteens and water skins, blew them up until they were taut, and tied them off, lashing them securely to the underside of the logs. Atsidi even used the cured intestine casing he carried, a long, thin tube that, when inflated, added precious buoyancy. In the center, they strapped the wooden box, wrapped in their last dry piece of canvas. It was a pathetic, ugly thing, a raft of pure desperation. They pushed it into the water. It floated, barely. "Get on," Atsidi commanded. "No, we lie behind it," Lenora countered, her voice shaking but firm. "We stay in the water, hide behind it, use it as a shield. The mist is low. They might not see us." He saw the wisdom in her words. They slid into the numbing, agonizing water, the icy shock of it stealing their breath. They grabbed the back of the raft, Lenora on one side, Atsidi on the other, and kicked off from the shore, letting the current take them. The world shrank to the sound of the black water rushing past, the sting of the wind, and the burn of the cold. The mist on the river was their only friend, a spectral, gray blanket that hid them from the shore. They were halfway across, their legs numb, their bodies a single, profound ache, when the first shot rang out. Crack, a rifle. From the bank they had just left, they had been seen. Zing. A bullet whined through the air, impossibly close, and skipped off the water just feet from Lenora's head. "They're here," she gasped, her voice a choked sob. "Keep low," Atsidi grunted, his voice strained. "Press to the logs. Kick." Another shot. Thwack! The bullet slammed into the log just above Lenora's hands, sending a spray of splinters and water into her face. She screamed, a short, sharp sound of terror. They were completely exposed. 2 dark heads and a flimsy raft, a perfect target in the last, silvery light. "Keep your head down," Atsidi ordered. "Breathe into the mist." He was right. The mist was rising as the air cooled, thickening. They pressed their faces to the rough, wet wood, holding their breath, kicking with legs that had no feeling left, just a dull, distant ache. The river was a gauntlet of lead and ice. They could hear shouts from the bank, curses swallowed by the wind. Another bullet, then another, but they were wilder now. The shooters firing at shapes in the deepening gloom. The raft hit the far bank not with a crash, but with a soft, sucking thud as it ran aground in a deep, muddy reed bed. For a moment, they just lay there, clinging to the logs, gasping for air, the profound, shuddering relief of solid ground beneath them. Lenora was the first to move. She unlashed the box, her fingers stiff and wooden. She scrambled up the muddy bank, lost her footing, and fell hard to her hands and knees. But she held the box high, its canvas wrapping dark with river water, but the contents safe. She was safe. They were across. "Get up!" Atsidi's voice was not triumphant. It was a low, urgent hiss. He was already on the bank, scanning the shore, his knife in his hand. "What?" she asked, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the word. He pointed, not back at the river, but west, inland, into the thick stand of cattails. There, in a patch of soft mud, was a single, perfect boot print. It was deep, fresh, and pointed away from the river, toward the fort. Someone had been waiting for them. The Pinkerton. He hadn't just destroyed the ferry. He had anticipated their desperate crossing and was already ahead of them, moving to cut them off. They were in a trap, and the back wall was a river full of gunmen. "The ditch," Atsidi said, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. He pointed to the skeletal remains of an abandoned farm, a collapsed sod house and the faint, dark line of a long, dry irrigation ditch that snaked away toward the hills. They plunged into it, crouching low, the reeds and overgrown weeds whipping at their faces. The ditch gave them cover, a sunken, secret road. They followed it for a mile, until it ended in a field of broken rock. There, Atsedi set a false trail, walking heavily in a patch of mud, heading north before they doubled back, stepping only on stones and slipping into a narrow, rocky wash that led south. They found shelter, if it could be called that, hours later, in a shallow depression on the side of a windswept butte. They were soaked to the skin, their horses were gone, and the temperature was plummeting. They had no supplies but the knife, the papers, and the clothes on their backs. They dared not light a fire. It would be a beacon in the vast, open prairie. As the last of the light died, Lenora saw it, far away, on the ridge they had just come from. A single point of light bloomed a campfire. Their pursuers. They were across the river, and they were arrogant. They were not afraid of being seen. They knew they had their prey trapped, cold and exposed. Lenora sank to the cold. Dry grass, her body giving out. The shivering was uncontrollable now. This was how it ended. Not with a bullet, but frozen to death in a ditch, just miles from safety. Atsidi sat, his back to the wind. He looked at her, his face a pale mask in the starlight. He said nothing, but lay down on his side, his back to her, and pulled her down, pressing her back against his. It was not a gesture of intimacy. It was a desperate, primal act of survival, a sharing of their last, flickering body heat. She lay stiffly at first, then gratitude and exhaustion overwhelmed her. She pressed back against the solid, lean warmth of his body. She could feel the steady, slow thump-thump of his heart through the buckskin, a rhythm against her own spine. It was a sound that was deep and calm and enduring. It was the sound of the earth, thump-thump, a buffalo-hide drum, an anchor in the cold, spinning darkness. She closed her eyes and listened to it, and for a little while, the shivering stopped. The dawn was a bruise, a cold, painful-looking purple that offered no warmth, only a cruel, sterile light. They were alive, barely. Atsidi moved, a low groan of pain escaping him, a sound she had never heard him make. He sat up, his movement stiff and slow. He looked at his arm. The makeshift bandage was a frozen, dark mass. The wound was no longer a simple gash. It was swollen, angry, the skin around it a dark, unhealthy red. "The bullet," he said, his voice a dry croak. "It is still in—" She saw it then, a small, puckered hole where the metal had torn through his sleeve. It hadn't been a splinter from the door. It had been a bullet. He had been shot, and he had not said a word. "It must come out," she said, her voice flat. He pulled his knife, the pale, bone-handled one. He looked at the blade, then at her. He didn't have the strength or the angle to do it himself. He held it out to her, handle first. The point, it must be clean. She took it. She poured the last few drops of water from her canteen over the blade, a pathetic, useless gesture of sanitation. "The arm," he said, holding it out. "You must hold it. Hard, so I do not pull away." She knelt in front of him. She took his wounded bicep in her two hands, her fingers digging in, bracketing the wound. His skin was hot with fever. He looked into her eyes, and she looked back. This was a trust that went beyond vows, beyond words. "Now," he said. She turned her head, unable to watch, but her grip did not loosen. She bit down hard on her own lip, tasting the salt of her blood. She felt him flinch. a violent full-body tremor as she dug her fingers in to hold him steady. He let out a single, sharp hiss of breath through his teeth, but he did not cry out. She felt a shift in his arm, a sickening, probing movement, and then his whole body went limp. She looked. He was holding a small, misshapen piece of lead in his bloody fingers. His face was beaded with sweat, as pale as ash, but he was breathing. "It is done," he whispered. She tore the last clean strip from her petticoat and bound the wound, her hands moving with a practiced, steady calm. It took them 2 more hours, half walking, half stumbling, to reach the road. They emerged from the prairie grass and saw it Hallett Road. It was a wide, clear path, 2 ruts of packed earth and gravel leading directly to the gates of the fort, which they could just see in the distance. And sitting squarely in the middle of it was a barricade, a wagon, turned sideways, flanked by 3 men in civilian clothes with rifles. They wore armbands, and even from this distance, Lenora could see the emblem, the stylized RO of the Rail and Ore Syndicate. It was a private toll booth, a private army. They owned the road. They owned the law. Atsidi pulled her back into the grass. "We will go around. Through the hills." "No," Lenora said. She was looking at the barricade, at the fort beyond. Her clothes were in tatters. Her hair was a wild mat. Her face was streaked with mud and his blood. She looked like a madwoman, and she had never felt more sane. "They are waiting for us in the hills," she said. "The Pinkerton. He's not at the road. He's where he thinks we will go." She clutched the wooden box to her chest. "They own the shadows. Atsidi, you said it yourself." She looked at him, her eyes burning with a cold, desperate, and utterly committed fire. "We have to walk in the sun." He met her gaze. He saw the logic. It was insane. It was suicide. And it was their only chance. He nodded. A slow, painful movement. Together, they stepped out of the tall grass. They left the cover of the wilderness behind, and side by side, a battered widow and a wounded Apache. They began the long, slow, and terribly public walk down the center of Hallett Road, straight toward the guns of their enemies. The walk down Hallett Road was the longest of their lives. They were a spectacle of ruin, 2 figures who seemed to have crawled from the very earth. Lenora, her dress in tatters, her face smudged with dirt and Atsidi's dried blood, clutched the wooden box to her chest like a holy relic. Atsidi walked beside her, his left arm held stiffly at his side, his face a pale, stoic mask of pain and fever. Every step was an agony, but he walked with a straight-backed, unbroken dignity. The 3 men at the barricade saw them coming from 100 yards out. They straightened up from their lazy slouch, rifles held loosely but ready. They were company men, their faces hard and incurious, their authority bought and paid for. Their leader, a beefy man with a drooping mustache, stepped forward, holding up a hand. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice a flat, confident bark. "This is a private road. Turn around." Lenora and Atsidi did not stop. They continued their slow, deliberate pace, closing the distance. The man's confidence wavered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had expected them to be furtive, to be hiding. He had not expected this open suicidal defiance. "Did you hear me?" he shouted, his rifle coming up a few inches. "I said, I heard you." Lenora's voice cut across his, clear and cold and carrying on the wind. "And you will hear me. My name is Lenora Vale. I am a citizen of the United States, and this is a public road. I have come to see the commanding officer of this fort." They were 20 yards away now. The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the scenario they had been briefed on. They were paid to stop fugitives, not to have a public confrontation with a woman who spoke like a schoolteacher and looked like a mad prophet. Just as the man with the mustache opened his mouth to argue, a new sound joined the tense standoff, the clatter of hooves. A small patrol of uniformed cavalrymen was riding out from the fort's main gate. At their head was a young officer, a lieutenant whose clean, sharply pressed blue uniform seemed at odds with the dusty, chaotic world around him. He had a lean, angular face and eyes that were clear, cold, and disconcertingly intelligent. He reined in his horse, his gaze taking in the scene with a quick, analytical sweep: the syndicate barricade, the armed men, and the two battered, mud-caked figures who had brought them all to a halt. "What is the meaning of this?" the lieutenant demanded, his voice crisp with an authority that was not for sale. Before the syndicate man could stammer out a reply, Lenora stepped forward. She held up the wooden box. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice shaking but unwavering, "my name is Lenora Vale. My husband, Elias Vale, was murdered 6 months ago in a mine collapse engineered by the Rail and Ore Syndicate. This box contains proof of that crime. These men," she gestured to the barricade, "are employees of that same syndicate, and they are illegally obstructing a federal roadway. I am formally requesting temporary protective custody as a material witness to a federal crime." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. He looked from Lenora's fierce, desperate face to the sullen, angry faces of the company men. He looked at Atsidi, standing silent and bleeding at her side. This was Maeve Hollis's man. This had to be Lieutenant Rowan. "That's a lie," a new voice boomed, rich and furious. Barnaby Sutter was riding from the direction of the fort, his horse at a canter. He was flanked by 2 more men, one of whom was a hard-faced man with a bowler hat and the dead-eyed stare of a professional. "The Pinkerton." Sutter pulled up, his face a mask of manufactured concern. "Thank God you're safe. Lieutenant, this Apache has taken her mind. He kidnapped the poor woman days ago. She's been through a terrible ordeal, doesn't know what she's saying." A small crowd was beginning to gather. Soldiers off duty, a few teamsters, and a handful of dirt-caked prospectors who had come to the fort for supplies. A low murmur went through them. An Apache kidnapper, a murdered miner. It was the stuff of high drama. "I am not a kidnap victim," Lenora stated, her voice ringing with indignation. "I am a widow, seeking justice." "She's a liar," one of the prospectors in the crowd suddenly shouted. But his voice was drowned out by another, "No, she ain't." A grizzled old miner with a cough that shook his whole body pushed his way to the front. "That's Elias Vale's wife." "All right." And Elias was a good man. He said Sutter was cooking the books. "That's right," another man called out. "We all heard him." A few of the other miners nodded, their faces grim. They moved to stand, not directly beside Lenora, but behind her, a small, silent phalanx of support. Lieutenant Rowan looked from Sutter's furious face to Lenora's determined one. He saw the shift in the crowd, the way the miners had instinctively chosen a side. His gaze was cold as a January river. "It seems we have a conflict of testimony," Rowan said, his voice dangerously calm. "And a potential crime on federal land. I am not a judge, but I am the law in this fort." He made a decision. "We will have a preliminary hearing, now." He pointed a gloved finger at a large, barn-like supply warehouse that stood just inside the fort's gates. "In there, Sergeant. Escort Mrs. Vale and her companion. Mr. Sutter, you and your men will attend as well, unarmed." The warehouse smelled of raw timber, burlap, and the dry, powdery scent of milled flour. It was a vast, dim space, filled with crates, barrels, and sacks of grain. Rowan dismounted and strode to the center, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He designated a stack of crates as a makeshift judge's bench. Soldiers took up positions by the door, their rifles held at a ready but non-threatening angle. The crowd of miners and teamsters shuffled in, lining the walls, their face grim and watchful. It was not a courtroom. It was a crucible. "The box, Mrs. Vale," Rowan said. Lenora stepped forward and placed the mud-stained box on the crate in front of him. With steady hands, she opened it. She laid out the contents one by one, the official duplicate claim and the small, leather-bound notebook. "This is my husband's claim," she said, her voice clear and strong in the cavernous space. "And this is the purchase offer from the syndicate, which he refused. It's dated October 10th. The accident was on the 21st. She then handed him the deed of sale the syndicate had filed after his death. "And this is the deed they produced, claiming he had sold his share. As you can see, it is also dated October 10th, A forgery, signed with a crude approximation of my husband's hand. A low, angry murmur went through the miners. And this, she said, opening the notebook, is his journal. He recorded the blasting schedules that don't match the company logs. He wrote of his concerns about Mr. Sutter's methods. He wrote about the shaping charges being set at odd hours, when only Sutter's personal crew was present. She looked directly at Sutter, who stood with his arms crossed, a contemptuous sneer on his face. He wrote that he believed Barnaby Sutter was preparing to collapse the mine, not to shape a vein, but to shape a coffin. The accusation hung in the dusty air, stark and brutal. Rowan looked at Atsidi. And you, sir, what is your testimony? Atsidi stepped forward. His voice was low, but it carried in the silence. He did not speak of murder or motives. He spoke of the land. The day of the collapse. Atsidi said, his eyes fixed on Rowan. I was hunting in the high ridges above Pale Drum Gap. The charges were set at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The main blast came from the coordinates that matched the secondary ventilation shaft, not the main gallery. The wind that day was from the north-northeast. It carried the dust plume toward Whiskey Creek, not back toward the main shaft. As the syndicate report claimed, the ground shook twice, a small tremor, then a large one. A shaping charge, then the main charge. He fell silent. His testimony was a collection of irrefutable, physical facts, the kind of details no one could know unless they had been there, and had known how to read the language of the wind and the rock. Sutter had heard enough. He saw the look on Rowan's face. He saw the grim, nodding heads of the miners. The game was over. He played his last card. He stepped forward, a practiced, conciliatory smile on his face. Lieutenant, he said, his voice a low, reasonable purr. Clearly there has been a tragic misunderstanding. This is a civil matter, a dispute over a contract, not a matter for the Army. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coin. The syndicate is prepared to make a generous contribution to the fort's discretionary fund to compensate for this waste of your valuable time. He tossed the pouch onto the crate. It landed with a heavy, obscene thud. Rowan stared at the pouch for a long, silent moment. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he drew back his foot and kicked it. The pouch flew through the air, bursting open as it hit the floor, showering the dusty planks with a vulgar, metallic rain of double eagles. Sergeant, Rowan's voice was like the crack of a whip. Put this man in irons. Chaos. The Pinkerton in the bowler hat moved first. He was a professional. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. He wasn't trying to save Sutter. He was creating a diversion to save himself. He drew his revolver and fired a single, wild shot at the high, timbered ceiling. A woman in the crowd screamed. A chip of wood rained down. The crowd surged back, a wave of panic. In that instant of confusion, Atsidi moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He threw himself at Lenora, shielding her with his body, and they rolled behind a tall stack of flour sacks. The Pinkerton was already backing toward a side door. Sutter, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, drew his own pistol. The other syndicate men followed suit. The soldiers raised their rifles. The warehouse erupted. The first volley from the soldiers was disciplined, aimed high, a warning. But Sutter's men were shooting to escape. A bullet tore through one of the flour sacks near Lenora's head, and the world dissolved into a chaos of noise, dust, and the sharp, choking smell of gunpowder and fine, white powder that filled the air like a ghostly fog. Lenora, her ears ringing, saw one of the soldiers' rifles fall to the floor, knocked from his hands as he wrestled with a gunman. She didn't think. She crawled, grabbed the heavy weapon, and scrambled behind a large freight wagon. She saw the Pinkerton fumbling with the latch on the side door. She rested the rifle on the wagon's edge, took aim, and fired. She wasn't aiming at the man. She was aiming at the wagon. The bullet slammed into the thick wooden spokes of the wagon wheel, shattering it. The heavy wagon listed, groaned, and crashed down on its axle, its bulk now blocking the side door completely. The Pinkerton was trapped. A short, brutal gunfight raged in the swirling white dust. The air was filled with shouts, the thunder of pistols, the high-pitched scream of a wounded man, and the terrified whinnying of horses outside. Through the haze, Lenora saw Sutter. He was not trying to escape. His face was contorted with a mad, obsessive rage. He had lost everything: his mind, his freedom, his reputation, and it was all her fault. He raised his pistol, ignoring the soldiers, and took a dead, two-handed aim at Lenora. She saw the black hole of the muzzle, saw the knuckle of his finger whiten on the trigger. Time seemed to slow, to thicken. A shape, dark and impossibly fast, launched itself out of the white haze. It was Apache. He flew through the air like a hawk diving from a cliff, a silent, deadly force. He did not tackle Sutter. He slammed his body into Sutter's outstretched arms. The gun went off with a deafening roar. The bullet, knocked off its course, went wide. It tore through the air and ripped into the large painted sign hanging over the warehouse entrance that read, U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. The sign exploded in a shower of splintered wood. No one was hit. Sutter and Apache crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Before Sutter could bring the gun around, Lieutenant Rowan was there. The barrel of his own Colt revolver pressed hard against Sutter's temple. Soldiers swarmed the remaining gunmen, clubbing them into submission with their rifle butts. It was over. The silence that fell was as sudden and as deafening as the noise had been. The air was thick with white dust that slowly began to settle, coating everything and everyone in a ghostly pallor. The sharp, metallic click-click of manacles being snapped onto Barnaby Sutter's wrists echoed in the quiet. From the crowd of miners, a single hoarse cheer went up, followed by another. It was a ragged, weary sound of victory. Then the great warehouse doors slid open, and a cold gust of wind swept through the building, carrying the cheer away, scattering it into the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. The infirmary at Fort Hallett was a room of stark, brutal honesty. It was not a place of comfort, but of function. The air was thick with the sharp, clean, and slightly nauseating smells of carbolic acid and whiskey used as antiseptic. The walls were rough, unpainted pine, and the floor was scoured to a pale, splintery white. It was a room that had seen too much of the body's fragility, a room stripped of all illusion. Apache lay on a narrow cot, his bare torso covered by a coarse wool army blanket. The fort surgeon, a harried, overworked man with blood on his spectacles, had cleaned and stitched the gash on his bicep. The wound was a neat, angry line of black thread against his fever-flushed skin. He was weak, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion and infection it had held at bay for so long. But the fever had broken. He was sleeping, a true, deep, healing sleep. Lenora sat on a low stool beside the cot. She had not left his side. A soldier's wife had brought her a basin of hot water, a bar of harsh lye soap, and a simple, borrowed calico dress. She had scrubbed the layers of mud, blood, and grime from her skin, and it felt like shedding a series of old, dead lives. Her hands were raw. Her face was still bruised, but she was clean. She was whole. She held his hand. His was limp in hers, the calloused, scarred skin surprisingly soft in repose. Her smaller, softer hand was a pale counterpoint to his dark, weathered one. She watched the steady, slow rise and fall of his chest. This was the rhythm she had clung to in the dark of the trapper's hovel, the heartbeat that had become her anchor. Here, in the sterile quiet of the infirmary, it was the sound of a promise kept. The door opened, and Lieutenant Rowan stepped inside. He moved quietly, his boots making little sound on the wooden floor. He looked from Apache's sleeping form to Lenora's watchful one. "The surgeon says he will be fine," Rowan said, his voice a low murmur. "He is strong. The fever is down." "I know," Lenora replied, her gaze not leaving Apache's face. Rowan stood for a moment, an awkwardness about him that was at odds with his crisp uniform. I have telegraphed the U.S. Marshal in Helena. He will be here in a week to take custody of Sutter and his men. The Pinkerton detective, a man named Cutler, has already given a full confession in exchange for a lesser charge. It seems Mr. Sutter's reputation for loyalty was not as solid as his reputation for greed. He placed a sheaf of papers on a small, rickety table. This is a provisional order of witness protection for you and for Mr. Cole. You are guests of the U.S. Army until the Marshal arrives. You are safe here. He paused, then added another, thicker document on top of it. And this is a temporary seizure order for the Morningstar mine and all associated assets of the rail and ore syndicate in this territory, pending federal investigation, on the recommendation of the assayer's office and based on the testimony of the local miners. I have been authorized to place the mine under the temporary management of a newly formed miners' guild. Lenora finally looked up at him. She saw not just an officer, but a good man, a rare and valuable thing. You've given it back to them, she whispered. I have restored the claim to those who have the right to work it. Rowan corrected her gently. Justice is a simple thing, Mrs. Vale. It is only the men who administer it that make it complicated. He gestured to the wooden box, which sat beside the papers. Its surface clean now, its purpose served. Your evidence has been sealed and placed in the fort's safe. It will be waiting for the marshal. She looked at the box. It was just wood and brass now. The ghosts it had contained had been exorcised. The weight of it, which she had carried on her back and in her heart for so long, was finally lifted. Thank you, Lieutenant, she said, and the simple words were filled with the weight of all she had endured. For everything. He gave a curt, almost shy nod. Get some rest, Mrs. Vale. The war is over. He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving them to the quiet peace of the aftermath. Later that afternoon, the clouds that had smothered the sky for days finally broke apart. Long golden shafts of late-day sun slanted across the prairie, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a glittering tapestry of diamonds. The world, washed clean by the storm, seemed to be breathing again. Atsidi was awake. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. He sat on the edge of the cot, the blanket draped over his shoulders. While Lenora told him of Rowan's orders, he listened in his usual silence. But she saw a flicker of something in his eyes when she spoke of the mine being returned to the miners. It was not surprise. It was a quiet, profound affirmation, as if he had witnessed the land itself righting a wrong. We should go, he said, his voice a dry rasp. You're not strong enough, she protested. I am strong enough to walk, he countered, and she knew it was not a request. They borrowed 2 horses from the fort's stable, gentle, grain-fed mares that felt sluggish and tame after the wild mustangs they had ridden. They did not speak of their destination. They both knew where they were going. They rode back into the wilderness, following the path of their desperate flight. But the land was different now. It was not a landscape of fear and pursuit. It was just the land, vast, beautiful, and utterly indifferent. They reached Silver Sage Spring as the sun was touching the tops of the western peaks. The light in the box canyon was soft and golden, the air still and deeply peaceful. The spring flowed over the rock, a sheet of liquid gold, reflecting a sky that was the color of a robin's egg. A sky so clear and clean it looked like a freshly washed blade. They dismounted and walked to the water's edge. The signs of their previous visit, the disturbed rocks, the muddy footprints were still there, a faint scar on the canyon's perfect peace. Lenora was still carrying the wooden box. It had felt wrong to leave it behind. Here, in this place where all hope had seemed lost. She set it down on a flat, mossy stone. She did not open it. She simply rested her hand on the smooth, worn wood. She took a long, deep breath and let it out in a sigh that seemed to carry the last of the winter's cold from her soul. I'm not going to burn it, she said, her voice quiet, conversational. She was speaking to Elias, to Atsidi, to the canyon itself. I'm not going to bury it. I thought I would, but I won't. She looked at Atsidi, a small, sad, but resolute smile on her face. I'm not burning the past. I'm using it to light the way. Atsidi knelt at the edge of the spring, He reached out and touched the surface of the water, his scarred fingers sending a cascade of tiny, concentric ripples across the perfect reflection of the sky. The water was frigid, but he did not flinch. He was feeling the land's pulse. "The wind has changed direction," he said, his voice a low murmur. Lenora looked at him, at his strong, quiet profile against the golden light. Her smile grew, losing its sadness, becoming something new, something warm and alive. "So have we," she replied, as the last of the sun vanished behind the canyon wall. The temperature dropped with a sudden, breathtaking intensity. A cold night wind, born on the high, lonely peaks, snaked its way into their sanctuary. It was a familiar cold, the same cold that had nearly killed her, the same cold that had driven her into his arms. An involuntary shiver went through her. Atsidi rose. He had brought one of the thick, cured deerskins from the fort. Without a word, he unfolded it and came to stand behind her. He wrapped the hide around her shoulders, his arms coming around her as well, pulling her back against his chest. It was the same embrace from the trapper's hovel, but it was entirely different. It was not born of desperation. It was a choice, a deliberate act of comfort, of shelter, of profound and quiet possession. His embrace was as complete and as calm as the surface of the spring at their feet. She leaned her head back against his solid shoulder, closing her eyes. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back. She was safe. Not just from Sutter, not just from the cold. She was safe from the loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long. She turned her head, tilting her chin up to look at his face, which was a mask of shadows and plains in the twilight. She lifted a hand and laid it on his chest, over his heart. She whispered the words that she had been carrying in her own heart ever since the chaos of the fort had ended, the words that had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact place. "Don't stop," she murmured, her voice no longer a desperate plea, but a soft, sure, and deeply felt command. "I need this." It was no longer the cry of a drowning woman for a lifeline. It was the statement of a woman who had found her ground and was choosing where to build her home. It was a choice for this man, for this moment, for this shared breath in the cold silence of the frontier. He lowered his head, and his lips found hers. It was a kiss that held no desperation, only a deep and patient certainty. It was a kiss that tasted of clean water and cold air and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. They stood there, wrapped in the hide, for a long, long time. The stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the blackening sky. The only sounds were the gentle, eternal whisper of the water flowing over the stone, and the soft, synchronized rhythm of their own breathing. There were no grand promises of forever, no talk of love. There were no words at all. There was only the simple, unspoken, and unbreakable commitment to walk through the seasons, whatever they might bring, together. And high above them, on the distant ridge, Ash Mesa, which had witnessed the storm and the flight and the bloodshed, seemed to let out a long, slow sigh of its own, a sigh of release, as if a great weight had been lifted from its stony shoulders. The frontier was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but here, in the cold silence of the night, two hearts were beating as one. A new warmth had taken root. A new home had begun. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.